Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tysky Sour. It's a Wednesday. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by co-founder and contributing editor of Navarro Media, Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very well, Michael. How are you keeping?
Well, though we had some sort of last-minute scares involving my internet, but I'm hoping it's all going to be tip-top for the show. And we do have a jam-packed show for you today. We're going to talk about government scientists contradicting themselves. This is a story which has emerged because of the government publishing its sage advice yesterday, and also the chief scientific advisor and deputy chief medical officer appearing in front of MPs tomorrow. There are a few parts of their story that just don't seem to add up. Then we're going to talk about the government claims that workers are addicted to furlough schemes. The bloody scroungers who are staying at home because of the lockdown like they were told to do by the government. Finally, we're going to get Alex Hern, who's technology editor at The Guardian, on to talk about contact tracing and the controversies about which platform the government will use. Should it be an NHS system or should they piggyback off the Google and Apple system? It's all, I've been getting to grips with it today. It's all incredibly interesting. As ever, tweet on the hashtag TyskySour and share the show link. We want to get as many people watching this as possible. Our first story, though, is what should have been leading the news over the last 24 hours, but in too many cases has not been. That's the fact that the UK has now got the highest death toll in Europe and the second highest death toll in the world. Now, given that we had 3 weeks extra warning when compared to Italy, who's the country that we've just overtaken in terms of those grim statistics, we might think this should be headline news. We had 3 weeks more warning than Italy. We have a younger population and we have smaller households. This all should have played into Britain's advantage, but it hasn't. Today, we rose above 30,000 deaths in terms of the government statistics. It's clearly higher than that if you look at what's coming out of the Office for National Statistics and also the Financial Times projections. But this wasn't used as an opportunity by many in the media to ask some serious questions about the government. No, they found more important things to talk about. We're going to go to the first example. So I was scrolling through the BBC Politics Twitter feed for the whole of yesterday, and they didn't mention once this fact that Britain had overtaken Italy in terms of death toll. They did, though, find time to tweet this. So Sophia wanted to make the card for Boris because she was really sad that he'd been rushed into hospital. The PM has posted a photo of the card made for him by 5-year-old Sophia. Now, this is the politics feed of our public broadcaster on the day when Britain has overtaken Italy in terms of the coronavirus death toll to have the second highest coronavirus death toll in the world. And BBC Politics is tweeting about, I'm sure she's a very nice young girl, 5-year-old Sophia. But to be honest, her writing a card to Boris Johnson shouldn't be headline news on that day. For everyone involved, for all of the media, if they wanted to ignore those grim death stats, they also had a huge gift delivered to them late yesterday evening, which was the news that Neil Ferguson had broken the lockdown twice, having his lover over in contradiction to government advice. So this was a story, this was a scoop for the Telegraph, who is Britain's home of lockdown skepticism, will be delighted to have taken out the scientist whose modelling helped shift the government to adopt a policy of stringent social distancing. It was also this story which led most of this morning's front pages, with one honourable exception, as we'll see shortly. And in turn, it was this story about Neil Ferguson which led most of the news channels. I'm going to start with a clip from the Today programme's paper review, where the hosts, let's say, seem reluctant to focus on one story in particular.
7:45, it brings us to, and time for a look at the papers and the websites. And the resignation of the government's scientific advisor, Professor Neil Ferguson, is on most of the front pages. The headline in the Telegraph, which broke the story, is "Lockdown Professor Steps Down After Breaking Rules to Meet Married Lover."
The Daily Mail's take on the story is "Professor Lockdown Quits Over Trysts with Married Lover," while the Sun's headline is "Prof Lockdown Broke Lockdown to Get His Trousers Down."
"How dare China spy on our virus labs," demands the Daily Express.
And finally, The Guardian reports that researchers from Exeter University have been trying to work out why otters play with pebbles and small rocks, juggling them or rolling them around with their paws. Theories include the possibility that it was a way of improving coordination or foraging skills. But after studying 48 otters at 3 wildlife parks in the UK, the scientists noticed that the animals did it more when they hadn't been fed. This led them to conclude that hunger was the main reason, although they still have to work out why.
12 minutes to 8 is the time for thought for the day.
So we should say that was the 7:45 paper review. At the first paper review at about 6 a.m, they did mention the Guardian front page. It hasn't been censored, but it was the Neil Ferguson story which led their news bulletin throughout the morning, and it was the Neil Ferguson story which led all of their paper reviews. And then they thought they should talk instead about the record deaths, talk about some story about otters. Aaron, I mean, I find it kind of annoying that you've got this government scientist who has, it seems, given quite good advice to the government and then can't follow it himself. It sort of reminds one of the Scottish chief medical officer who was caught out visiting her second home twice during lockdown. It's like, come on, you've got to hold yourself to higher standards. But at the same time, it does seem like the media have missed the real story here. They've got their priorities somewhat the wrong way round.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, he should resign. He was completely in the wrong. You can't have somebody pontificating with public advice in the public interest and then not adhering to it yourself. So he should resign. That's the first thing. Secondly, I've seen some people on the right-wing journalists saying, well, and the American right went really big on this. Oh, this guy's resigned. He was the one who came up with this outrageous figure of maybe 500,000 people dying in the UK. If you look at Sweden, we know that, that couldn't happen. It would mean that, X number of people would be dead. So far, it's far lower. Hold on 1 minute. We had a lockdown and already maybe as many as 50,000 people have died. So the idea that he had some monstrously out there number, which was nowhere near reality, is patently false. Everything we've experienced so far, we have around 30,000 actually official deaths, but it could be as high as 45 to 50,000 with the lockdown. That's the first thing. Secondly, do you remember those kind of films in the 1990s, or maybe you watched the news in the 90s, early 2000s, before the global financial crisis, and the final story would always be like something really stupid and sentimental and just crappy. And finally tonight, this stupid story about a cat that baked a cake and it was delicious. Some stupid feel-good story, some folksy story. That is now how Britain's public service broadcaster actually does journalism. That's the default. It isn't some cutesy appendage to the real news, kind of a ha-ha joke at the end of the show. It's what leads with BBC's radio broadcast and TV broadcast news, and its online news as well. And I think today, look, the Today programme is the most listened to current affairs radio show in this country. Yes, that figure was mentioned in the 6 a.m. Front page gloss. It wasn't later on, but even at 6 a.m. it was sort of barely mentioned. The thing about the otters, I mean, this is concerning, because at least in authoritarian countries where there's censorship of the press, the media is this supplicant and this genuflect and this cowardly because they have no alternative. They have to do that. What's the BBC's excuse?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was actually, talking about the horrific deaths, I'm sure we'll get back to the media. There was a brilliant story actually in Reuters yesterday, which I didn't see on any of the BBC news bulletins, but there we are, which was explaining why the death toll had got quite so high. And I suppose let's actually start with a slide from the government, which shows that over the last, or the reason why deaths have been increasing so rapidly at this point in the crisis is especially pushed up by deaths in care homes. So you'll see that initially most of the deaths that we saw in Britain were in hospitals. And as the weeks have gone on, the proportion of people dying in care homes has increased and has kept increasing right up until the week beginning the 24th of April. And the reason for that is quite simple and also quite shocking. So we're now going to get up a quote from this Reuters piece suggesting why this wave is happening now. So how did infection take hold in care homes? According to several care home managers, a key route for infection was opened up by an NHS decision taken in mid-March as Britain geared up for the pandemic to transfer 15,000 patients out of hospital and back into the community, including an unspecified number of patients to care homes. These were not only patients from general wards, they included some who had tested positive for COVID-19, but were judged better cared for outside hospital. A Department of Health guidance note dated April the 2nd and published online further stated that negative tests are not required prior to transfers, admissions into the care home. Now, this is phenomenal. I mean, it's appalling. And this should be on the front page of the newspapers this morning, not, you know, whoever some scientist decided to sleep with, even though we've said that was a stupid thing to do. The fact that when the government were on our airwaves saying that we're cocooning the elderly because we should have been cocooning the elderly because they're the most vulnerable people to COVID-19. They are the people for whom coronavirus is most likely to kill, and many of them it has killed. Whilst they were talking a big talk about cocooning these people, they were actively sending people from hospital back into care homes without testing them. Now, that is remarkable. And I mean, just severely negligent. I mean, one, we also have to remember that this isn't, you hear the Toby Youngs of the world sort of trying to say these people would have died anyway. Maybe in a year or two, but they wouldn't necessarily have died alone, which is what happens with coronavirus. And also, I mean, for the people that are working in care homes, this all just seems absolutely hellish. And so much of it was avoidable and foreseeable. And it's not getting the attention it deserves. Aaron?
There was a tweet yesterday by Lewis Goodall at Newsnight, and they did a great piece of reportage. And I think the average mortality rate, so basically in a given month on average, of all the people in Britain's elderly care homes, around 2.3, 2.4% of them pass away, which you would expect. Obviously, these are elderly people, often very sick. I believe that doubled. I think it went to 4.5, 5.4, 5.6, 5.8. It doubled. So that's a huge increase in the number of people dying in elderly care homes. And again, this right-wing thing about, oh, well, they were going to die anyway, or they died with coronavirus, they didn't die because of coronavirus. You know, they love talking about victims of communism or Mao's China with the Great Leap Forward, or these big historical, or okay, Genghis Khan, the 13th century, you know, he apparently killed millions of people in Central Asia and Iran. Do people go, well, look, 30% of the people he killed had underlying health conditions, so they don't really count. Nobody has ever done this form of accountancy for human tragedy before. Oh yeah, well, you know, the starvations in the Ukraine under the Stalin regime in the USSR. Well, actually, we think a couple of million of those probably we're going to die anyway in the next couple of years. They had underlying health conditions. Nobody says this. Nobody says this. The fact people are only saying about using this phrase, this analytic framework in this particular instance, I think what it tells you actually, it speaks to the extent of the fuck up. It does. I don't like using that word in politics, but it is a tragedy. And the fact that people are having to find these get outs because the numbers are so indefensible. You know, we have had potentially 45 to 50,000 deaths with the lockdown. Can you imagine if we hadn't? You know, we would be looking at what, double that, triple that. And what's interesting is actually even in March, when we were talking about this stuff, I remember you talking about this very lucidly on Tisky Sour, Michael, as you have done for this entire, episode of the coronavirus pandemic. And you said the best thing we can do is basically to send every elderly person to the Isle of Wight or to the Highlands and sort of, cordon them off, create a cordon sanitaire between them and the rest of the population. We did the precise opposite with a significant number of people in elderly care. And again, when there is that inquiry or that investigation into this, heads are going to have to roll because people here are accountable for negligence on such a scale that it's led to thousands of unnecessary deaths, thousands of unnecessary deaths, right? Historically, that's a big deal. You think of the thalidomide babies. You think of the administration of use of chemical warfare, chemical weapons against British soldiers at Porton Down in the 50s. People were horrified at this stuff. Oh my God, how could you do this? Well, we didn't know the full consequences. Really, extensive negligence. You're seeing these kinds of stories now happen with the coronavirus pandemic, day after day after day after day. And it really is it's an indictment on the civil service, on various multiple agencies, on the government, on members of the shadow cabinet. It's appalling. It's really, really appalling. And I think actually the inquiry has to be a very extensive one. It should be judge-led. People should have to swear under oath. And it should actually be looking into why did the British state lack so much capacity that these, because obviously in any crisis, people screw up. I get that. but we're seeing such a compounding of screw-ups day after day. There has to be a big structural explanation for this. Now, you and I would agree what that is: neoliberalism, austerity, the fact that we've hollowed out the state for 30, 40 years. But I think ultimately that's going to have to be the conclusion. How else do you explain dozens of agencies and individuals and the government itself screwing up so monumentally?
I have to clarify. I can't claim credit actually for that analogy about sending all of the young and fit population to one part of the country and putting all of the elderly population in another, because it was actually said by Professor Graham Medley on Newsnight back in mid-March. We've now found out, sits on SAGE. So you would have expected that advice to get through to the government, and the government to have been actively cocooning older people instead of sending basically ticking time bombs back into elderly homes, which is people who've just been in hospital and haven't been tested, or have even tested positive, but they wanted to get them out because they said their condition wasn't that serious. So you had the scientists saying one thing and the government doing the complete opposite, which links to our next story, which is about the government being, the government not so much being led by the science as scientists being led by the government. But first of all, you're watching Tisky Sow, you're watching Novara Media. We want to get more people watching this show, so please share the show link. Our next story, as I say, is on government scientists contradicting themselves, which shows they have been following the government all along. So as we've seen, Neil Ferguson's resignation could be used as a rather convenient distraction from Britain's official coronavirus death toll. It also creates a further problem. That's because Neil Ferguson was one of the few experts who sits on SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, who is not directly employed by the government. So the chief medical officer, the deputy chief medical officer, the chief scientific advisor, all of these people are employed by the government. Neil Ferguson is employed by Imperial College, but gives the government advice. So he might be more independent than they are. And this is particularly important because new evidence has emerged. This is something obviously we've been suspicious of on Tisky Sow for a very long time, but these scientists who are employed by the government tend to be more than willing to cover for them, and to often cover for them in a very unscientific way. This was evident in SAGE advice newly released yesterday, which showed the scientists said things in private which contradicted what they said publicly. It was also apparent in evidence given by the chief scientific officer, Patrick Vallance, and the deputy chief medical officer, Jenny Harris, to the Health and Social Care Select Committee yesterday. I want to take a look at a couple of those key examples. So the first is from the newly published SAGE minutes. This was on the 3rd of March. SAGE met to discuss the use of behavioural and social interventions on a COVID-19 epidemic in the UK. A very interesting document in general, but what's particularly interesting is this particular paragraph. So it says there was agreement that government should advise against greetings such as shaking hands and hugging, giving existing evidence about the importance of hand hygiene. A public message against shaking hands has additional value as a signal about the importance of hand hygiene. Now, that was on March the 3rd, and we know that SAGE meetings are chaired by Patrick Vallance or Chris Whitty, so the chief scientific advisor or the chief medical officer, mostly both of them. Now, on that same day, so on March the 3rd, this is what was said in a government press conference with Boris Johnson, flanked by Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance.
Well, Victoria, I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know, and I continue to shake hands. And I think it's very important that we, people obviously can make up their own minds. I think that Matt has said that people must make up their own minds, but I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts. But our judgment is wash. Washing your hands is the crucial thing.
One, Boris Johnson, completely stupid. I was shaking hands with people with coronavirus. But then the journalist, or actually it was Boris Johnson, explicitly passes on that question to Patrick Vallance, who we know sat in a meeting that day where the minutes from that meeting, so what was agreed by all of the scientists there as official advice was to tell people to stop shaking hands. He stood there, sort of shrugged his shoulder and said, just shake your hands. So he was directly contradicting what was agreed that day by scientists. Why? To cover for Boris Johnson. And we were supposed to believe that these were the scientists who were leading government. No, it was clearly the other way around. There's another example. So this is from the Health and Social Care Committee yesterday. And this is not Patrick Vallance. This is Jenny Harris. So she is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the UK. She was asked yesterday by Jeremy Hunt, who was a terrible health secretary, but is actually quite good at being chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. She was asked about the UK's decision to stop community testing back in March. This is what she said.
The issue here is what capacity do we have to undertake testing, and where should that be prioritised? So in the unlikely event that a country has unending capacity to test, then I think we would continue. However, there is an issue around capacity, and it's not just the testing. I think, unfortunately, some of the conversations have ended with perhaps just thinking about the testing. It's the action that goes with it.
So that was Jenny Harris there saying what we always, suspected all along, which was the reason that the government stopped community testing was because the government didn't have capacity to do community testing at that point. It was an issue of capacity. That's a reasonable answer. The problem is, what Jenny Harris said there when she was under scrutiny from MPs is in direct contradiction to what she said on March 26 when she was explaining government policies to the press and the public. So on March 26 at a press conference, she was asked why Britain had gone against WHO advice and stopped mass community testing. A similar question to that asked by Jeremy Hunt. Let's take a look.
But there comes a point in a pandemic where that is not an appropriate intervention, and that is the point really where we moved into delay, and although we still do some contact tracing and testing, for example in high-risk areas like prisons or care homes, that is not an appropriate mechanism as we go forward.
So that was Jenny Harris saying the reason we're stopping community testing is because it's not medically appropriate. It's a matter of epidemiology. She's not saying it's a matter of capacity. She's saying one thing to the public, another thing under scrutiny from MPs, just like Patrick Vallance is saying one thing in a SAGE meeting and saying another thing to the press and the public. I mean, Aaron, this completely undermines the claim that the government have been making that they have been led by the science. And to me, me watching these, when there is an inquiry, when there is investigative journalism into it right now, this really doesn't make these scientists look very good, does it?
Well, Jenny Harris in particular, I remember when we were commenting on that second clip we just played towards the end of March, and she said, well, WHO guidance comes from the World Health Organization. The clue is in the name, world. You have different healthcare systems, and you think, what? A viral pandemic, you have the transmission of a virus. It's human to human, doesn't really matter what society you're in. The presumption was that the NHS would have such capacity that it could basically take this on. But that appears just to have been an article of faith. There doesn't seem to have been any science behind it. The preparations were there for something equivalent to a seasonal flu. And even when Jenny Harris is talking in late March, it's as if she thinks we're going to have a seasonal flu, that we weren't dealing with something with a far higher level of mortality. We weren't dealing with something which is actually in many ways far more contagious because it's asymptomatic and so on. It's strange. It's kind of like they were in this psychological denial of just the extent of this problem for weeks, really, until the government has its first coronavirus action plan on March the 3rd. But I don't think it's until the end of March that actually we get moving. And when you think that, the Americans were putting in bids, we now know this. Panorama did a great piece of journalism on this. The Americans were putting in bids for PPE from British firms. Please ramp up production. We're going to import it from you. And yet our domestic senior science advisors are still behaving like it's really just a flu epidemic 6 weeks, 8 weeks later. You don't want to obviously attack individuals in this context, but Jenny Harris in particular seems very remiss in her duties. And again, I think it's right to say, look, this is not about a few bad apples or bad people or people who are incapable of scientists. I think you're entirely right, Michael. The way these incentives stack up, if you want to be a science advisor for government, you have to toe a particular line. There are a certain set of parameters you can't step outside of. I don't think that's a good way to operate in a society where we want good, objective, scientific advice given to politicians so that they can act in full receipt of the facts and an objective analysis of what's going on rather than what they want to hear. And increasingly, it sounds like, and this is a generous reading, by the way, it sounds like they are being told what they want to hear. Of course, there's another layer to this. We know to an extent that Dominic Cummings and other people close to Boris Johnson were in at those meetings. We could infer that perhaps there were other real-time conversations happening between the science advisors and Dominic Cummings. Again, incentives really all over the place. Dominic Cummings' job is to make sure Boris Johnson gets re-elected. The job of senior government science advisors is to offer objective scientific analysis and advice. You have different incentives. Please, please, please. You shouldn't have one of these guys telling one of these guys, i.e. Dominic Cummings telling Jenny Harries or Chris Whitty what they should or shouldn't be doing, or what advice is or isn't wise. Very, very, very dangerous. And again, one for any future inquiry or investigation.
And I mean, I think the real issue here is you can't have your cake and eat it. So it could be the case that the job of scientists employed by the government is one to, sort of advise them in private and then in public go out and bat for them to the hilt. Yep. That is what some employees are supposed to do, and that would be a legitimate job. But that is completely in contradiction to the job of being an independent authority, which we are supposed to, defer to. And so there was a complete category error made by the mainstream media during this period, which was to suggest that these were independent scientific authorities when actually they were employees of the government behaving like employees of the government, perfectly willing to cover for them. And it seems, quite frankly, to lie to do so. We're going to go on to our next story in one moment. First of all, if you're enjoying the show, please like the video. Also, most importantly, subscribe. If you're watching this and you are not already a subscriber to the Novara Media YouTube channel, click that button. And we have a super chat from Alan Kennedy with $5. Thank you very much for that. And a comment: I gave you another subscriber by linking your show to a friend. He said, "Oh yeah, the communist lady, I liked her." So there you go. It is always welcome when you tell your friends about this show. And obviously, Ash Sarkar has been improving the reputation of Novara Media since, I suppose, 2015, getting us all of those subscribers with those fabulous Barneys with Piers Morgan, one of the surprise heroes of this particular moment. Our next story is about the government returning to type in how it talks about Britain's working class. So this was a story which was broken in the Times yesterday, but which is now throughout all of the papers. The government are being quite open about it, which is that they are planning on tapering off the government furlough scheme. Now, the government furlough scheme was the system whereby the government, to pay for people to stay at home during a lockdown, they would pay for 80% of people's wages if their employers wanted to tell them to not come into work for a few weeks or a few months even. And the idea was that people wouldn't lose valuable relationships with their employers. So instead of just having all of these unemployed people because of a lockdown, we have an economy which is much more capable of bouncing back afterwards. It's worked quite well. It's been expensive, but I'd say it's wholly worth it. But there are some people in the Tory party who are getting cold feet about this. We'll discuss why in a moment. But first, let's go to the story in the Times where this was broken and a couple of quotes. So let's get up graphic 5. Rishi Sunak is preparing to wean businesses and workers off the government's furloughing scheme by cutting wage subsidies amid concerns that the nation has become addicted. The Chancellor will announce plans next week to wind down the scheme from July as part of an attempt to get people back to work as the lockdown is eased. He met officials yesterday to discuss the options, which include cutting the 80% wage subsidy and lowering the £2,500 cap on monthly payments. This story here follows from a push from the right-wing papers and Tory funders to get Britain back to work. So it's probably not a coincidence that this story dropped. It was briefed, obviously, by Rishi Sunak's allies on the day after the Telegraph led with this. So let's look at this front page. More than half of all adults now paid for by the state, or now paid by the state. Now, this is a completely stupid figure. It includes anyone who works for the public sector, furloughed or not, and it also includes all pensioners. So this is completely unscientific, not the kind of statement that I think an economist would give you. This is basically political propaganda from the Daily Telegraph. But what it's showing you is that there is serious concern amongst Britain's establishment that people in this country are getting used to state intervention, and Rishi Sunak seems to be fairly worried about it as well. Aaron, July, this is when they're talking about tapering off this furloughing scheme. Obviously, the furlough scheme has to be tapered off at some point. We're not always going to have the government paying 80% for people not to go into work for unlimited periods of time. But July, that's less than 2 months away. We're not going to have a vaccine for 18 months. The government advice has been to stay at home for a very long time. And if people have their furlough tapered, if people are forced to go back to work for financial reasons, we're going to have rush hour at 9 a.m. however, or at 10 a.m., however they manage to taper start times at work, which is what they're planning to do. You can't keep people separate if they all have to go into work. This seems completely irresponsible.
Yeah, well, there's clearly different camps on this inside the cabinet. And what's interesting is Boris Johnson repeatedly says, and it could just be a communications thing, right? Like, I thought it was a very good formulation you offered the other day. What we'll do is Sweden and say it's South Korea. So Boris Johnson's saying that no, we shouldn't lift the lockdown, it's bad, and then saying that while we lift the lockdown. I think that could just be a plausible strategy. At the same time, I do think there are different diverging views on this in cabinet, and we've seen this for a few weeks now. There are people who want the furlough scheme to be extended, who want an authoritarian lockdown. They know that's quite a popular thing. They want to be popular. They want to be re-elected. They also understand the scale of the economic challenge. The furlough scheme itself is backdated. It lasts for 3 months. It's backdated to March 1st. I believe it elapses June 30th. That's already been one extension. And now the debate is, well, it can be extended further, but it would go, as you've just said, to 80 to 60 to 40, sort of falling down. And what this means is, whilst the public health crisis basically started on the 1st of March, or the beginning of March, the actual economic crisis begins in July. That's when the real economic sort of meltdown comes, if this is what happens. And it's important to say that the furloughing scheme and the various extensions of credit, the lines of credit given to small businesses, medium-sized businesses, multinationals, these aren't worker subsidies. These are overwhelmingly, these are business subsidies. These were subsidies to businesses to ensure that they could meet payroll requirements and presumably in 3 to 4 months go back to business as usual. Increasingly, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. But the idea these are worker subsidies is a nonsense. It guaranteed that people still could keep up final demand, buy goods and services. There wasn't a complete economic depression. And it also meant that rather than many, many businesses shut, they could kind of go into deep freeze and come back out July, August. We know that's not happening. What the left should be arguing for, I believe, is rather than saying, well, furlough should be extended, I think that's an unwise thing to argue for, personally. Some sectors will be fine. Some sectors won't. Which means, well, what do? You could argue, I don't think it's a wise argument, you could have furlough schemes for people that work in hospitality, hotels, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, live music, football, sports, because that's not opening up again anytime soon. None of those jobs are coming back anytime soon. I don't think that's a wise thing to do. What we should do is just basically say, look, we're going to increase job seekers allowance. We're going to double it. We're going to have very generous unemployment benefit in this country. And that's because many, many people will be on it for a pretty long time. And we can carve a national consensus about whether we think that's too high or too low. This is what I think Labour should be saying in several years' time. But right now, it's a medium-term solution. The furlough was a short-term solution, a medium-term solution until we need a vaccine. I think massively increasing, or massive is a hyperbolic word, a significant increase in job seekers allowance until we have a vaccine is an entirely legitimate policy proposal. And it would benefit both businesses and workers. Very, very, very simple, easy thing to deliver. Okay, it might add 100 billion to spending for 1-2 years. But given the human cost, given the cost you might see to what economists call human capital, employees who become unemployed for 2, 3, 4 years, can't make ends meet, it would be a very dangerous thing. The alternative is increasing GSA and also at the same time having some means by which these people can upskill. Wouldn't it be great if the Department for Health, the Department for Education, and higher education said, well, we know many, many people will be unemployed. Alongside JSA, we'll offer free university, courses to people seeking work. Again, it could just be a short-term thing. It could be an opportunity to boost productivity long-term. But that isn't the wavelength right now for the government. The question is, what's Labour's response going to be?
Yeah, I suppose I'd probably disagree with you a bit there, because I think we probably should just keep the furlough going. If we're going to keep something that looks a lot like a lockdown going, we should keep something which looks a lot like a furlough going, at least until a vaccine is found, or that we've got a serious system of contact tracing, which means that we can properly suppress the virus. I'd also add that what I think is really worrying here is the language of austerity returning. So they're saying that people who are on these furlough schemes have become addicted to them. So the idea is that, people are enjoying being at home, getting 80% of their wages so much that why would they return back to work? It's a sort of moralizing argument to say that having a decent benefit which respects people's basically right to have a comfortable life whilst dealing with a pandemic which they didn't cause is somehow this sort of moral failure of people, and we've got to kick them up the arse by taking away this financial support. And for one, I think that was always a stupid argument to make during austerity anyway. This idea that we should have a welfare system that disciplines people back into work only really helps employers, because it means that you can pay much lower wages, because the alternative to taking those lower wages is to live a miserable life, getting bullied by the job centre. But in this situation, it's extra ridiculous, right? It's a bit like Matt Hancock saying, "Oh, the people in care homes are getting pretty addicted to ventilators at this point in time." It's like, this is a pandemic. These people have no choice but to be home furloughed. They're doing precisely what is needed to deal with a pandemic, just like people who are using ventilators are doing precisely what is needed during a pandemic. It's not a question of incentives. It's a question of providing what people's most basic necessities in the middle of a public health crisis.
But do you not think there are significant differences between parts of the labour market? There are some parts of the labour market that could go back to business as usual, or actually never really stopped business as usual. There are other parts, for instance, we may see schools return to a semblance of normality in a couple of months. We can dispute whether that's a wise idea or not, but it seems like it's going to happen. But if you're a barber or a hairdresser or a masseuse, you're probably not going to have a job for a couple of years. So I suppose you would argue then that those people should be furloughed until we, like you say, have a vaccine for 2 years. I just don't see why you wouldn't just give them job seekers allowance. Give them the same amount of money. I'm not disputing that. Give them a very generous amount of money. But I just, either you have sectoral furlough agreements, right? Because some jobs are going to struggle more than others. But then the Tories won't do that, because they'll say, well, look, they're all about a free labour market and a mobile labour market. Well, if you can't get a job as a hairdresser, you can go be a shelf stacker at Tesco. So that doesn't really buy into their worldview. They will say there are jobs there. Why can't you just go and do those ones? Of course, in the whole, there are fewer jobs in the aggregate sense. So I do think, reforming job seekers allowance and that being a medium-term demand, I don't think it's stupid. I mean, I do think the idea that we furlough every hairdresser, every person that works in low pay service work for 2 years, I just don't think that's a productive use of human beings to start with. Maybe they don't want to do those jobs. Maybe they want to do other jobs in the future. They might want retraining, upskilling, and so on. So I think as a sort of social democratic solution, I don't think it's necessarily the wisest one. Surely some of these people may say, well, can I do a degree in the meantime and retrain and become something else? Okay, great. That's a great opportunity, not just for you, but also for Britain as an economy, as a society. So I don't know. I think the furlough scheme is very good short term. I certainly think we should rush off it. It's been extended once to June the 30th. I don't see why we couldn't just extend it another couple of months. I agree with you on that. But I think it's fair to say that there are many, many, many jobs which aren't going back to business as usual anytime, maybe till 2022, 2023. So there's a conversation there on the left about how do we respond to that.
We are going to go to Alex Hern in one moment. But first of all, we're going to very briefly discuss some breaking news, which has come through, I think, just before we went live, which is that Nadia Witham, MP, she's been on our show to talk about social care. When the coronavirus lockdown began, she decided to return to her previous sector as a carer for the elderly. But she now says she's been sacked from that role because she spoke out about the lack of personal protective equipment. Let's just get up a quote from the write-up. Can we get that up now? Or if not, we'll get that up in a moment. So, I mean, this would fit with what has become a widespread situation, which is that people who are working on the front line without adequate access to PPE are unable to whistleblow about it because they're told that they will get fired if they do. Now, often what you get is you get public health bosses who say, this is not us being cynical and us protecting ourselves. This is that we don't want the public to be panicked. And I'm sure that her care home bosses will probably have said the same thing. They say, we don't want to panic the people who are related to these elderly workers. But it also very conveniently means that no one finds out about the serious deficiencies which are going on in these sectors. I think we can get these quotes up now. So this is from the Mirror write-up, who I think broke the story. So Miss Witham, 23, who has never blamed the company for the lack of PPE, said she was appalled. But the Nottingham East MP added it was her duty to be honest about the lack of PPE and testing, which is putting lives at risk. For so many in social care who work for poverty pay, speaking out is not an option. This is wrong and dangerous for residents. In an email seen by the Mirror, Miss Witham was told she would no longer be asked to do shifts at the care home because she had spoken to the media about her concerns over PPE shortages and the safety of staff and residents in the retirement village in Nottinghamshire. Now, this idea that you just, fire people essentially. I mean, Nadia Witham is lucky enough to have another job as an MP, so this isn't going to mean she gets kicked out of her home or whatever. But there will be many people for whom speaking out about a lack of PPE causes them serious financial problems, and this is really silencing people. It's gagging people about one of the most important issues for the public to know about right now.
Yeah, you had the Sunday Telegraph. You had the Sunday Telegraph, and they had a leading article, and it said that 50% of healthcare workers, I think maybe it was doctors, have had to buy their own PPE. And so those doctors or the healthcare professionals interviewed to get that data are effectively disclosing something similar to Nadia Witham. Of course, they're doing it anonymously. What we know, whether it's the testimony of people like Miss Witham, or whether it's the doctors who were speaking to this survey, which was then published in the Sunday Telegraph, is that there's not enough PPE. We've got mortality rates in care homes in Britain double what they should be. Clearly, a major reason why is the absence of PPE. Clearly, there's a major public interest in healthcare workers or care workers shouting from the rooftops that there is insufficient amounts of PPE for them to do their jobs properly and safely. And by the way, as a worker, one of the first things you should be entitled to is a safe workplace. And she wasn't. And so absolutely, she should have whistleblowed. She did. And what I'm most curious about, Michael, is where are the free speech people going to be? Because people like Toby Young and many of these right-wing eccentrics like to talk about free speech. They like to talk about how they're being gagged and censored. Well, we're in a pandemic where as many as 45, 50,000 people could have died, where the government has behaved wholly inadequately in the stockpiling of protective equipment before it occurred, acted too slowly, has had insufficient testing, and really has had an absence of political leadership all the way through to today. Where are they? Why aren't they defending the right of Miss Witham to talk about the lack of PPE, the fact she's having to work in an unsafe workplace, as are hundreds of thousands of people across the country? I'm curious, or does the free speech demand only extend to privately educated boys who probably miss the debates at Oxford University Union just a bit too much? Makes you wonder.
We are about to move on to our final story. So if you have any questions you want us to ask at the end, start putting them on Twitter now on the hashtag TyskySour, or you can put them in the comments on the YouTube stream. For our final story, pretty much everyone now seems to be agreed that the best way to exit lockdown is mass testing and contact tracing so that cases of COVID-19 can be isolated. It's also a given that the only way to do this on a large enough scale will be some kind of automated phone app. There is, however, controversy about what kind of app that should be. And over the past couple of days, this seems to have really kicked off on tech Twitter. As I'm a bit out of my depth with anything more technical than doing a PowerPoint presentation or finding a hookup on Grindr, I'm delighted to have on the show someone who understands the back end of phone apps, not just how to download them, and why the government's choice of test and trace application has proven controversial. Alex Hern is technology editor at The Guardian. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
A real pleasure to have you on. I want to start with first principles. For the basic among us, like myself, how does a contact tracing app work?
So the way we're going with most apps these days, the sort of current state of the art, uses Bluetooth. It uses the same signal that my headphones are connected to the computer with. It uses the same signal that we use for most wireless accessories. Your phone, under any of these contact tracing apps, begins constantly transmitting a random identifier, basically yelling into the ether, "Hi, I'm me, I'm here, remember me. Hi, I'm me, I'm here, remember me." Every other phone is listening out for those same random identifiers. This part so far is in common with every contact tracing app. Where things start to differ is what happens if you get COVID-19 and if you say, "I'm infected." Under one model, you tell the NHS, "Hey, I have COVID-19. Here's all of the signals I heard. Here's all of the other phones going, 'Hey, I'm me.' here are their random identifiers. The NHS gets that list of numbers and then pings each of them going, oh, hey, we were told you might have been exposed to COVID-19. That model is called the centralized model because it involves the NHS having a centralized repository of the data of who's been exposed to COVID. The decentralized model is slightly different. Rather than my phone telling the NHS, hey, here's everyone I've heard, my phone tells the NHS, hey, here's all the random identifiers I've sent out. Here's all the names I've shouted into the void. The NHS gets that and then sends that to every phone saying, if you've heard any of these names, you've probably been exposed. Go seek a test. The difference is that in the latter version, the NHS has no way of knowing whether anyone has actually been exposed to me. It doesn't have any information other than me sending them the list of what I've been yelling into the void for the last 2 weeks. And that difference is the nub of what the controversy today is about.
And so the controversy, I suppose, if I've got this right, is so the NHS, they're saying we want to use a centralized system. And the reason we want to use a centralized system is because all of this information, all of this data is incredibly useful. One of the reasons why, the response to COVID-19 has been somewhat lacking is because the government have felt underinformed. They don't know how many people have the app or how many people are even in contact with each other. And if they get an app which passes them all the data, that's an absolute treasure trove which could be used to do amazing things with public health. The other argument is that that's giving the government way too much information, and it's better to have a decentralized system which does nothing other than tell people if they've been in contact with someone who's had COVID-19, and it's very difficult for the government to infer anything else from that.
Absolutely. So that's like the principles-based disagreement here, right? The question of how much information about the pandemic do we want the government to have? And to really see this, you can go for sort of the stark extremes. At one end, the extreme of an untrustworthy government having this data, you could well imagine a situation in which the government goes, okay, well, this contact trace we can see resulted in 170 exposures over the last 2 weeks. That means this person has almost certainly been breaking the social distancing guidelines. And so we should not only send out the contact alert, we should also refer this to the police because this is evidence of a crime under the lockdown legislation. That would obviously be a wild breach of the social contract under which these contact tracing apps would be done, but it's the sort of thing that privacy activists are concerned about. At the other end, the decentralized model, you could end up with a situation where the NHS knows that there have been 700 exposures through this contact tracing app, but doesn't know if that's resulted in 700 other people being potentially exposed to COVID-19 or 70,000. And it has no idea at what stage in the infection curve we're at. It gains no extra information. And we are at the situation we're at now, except we're trying to operate a fully open or at least reduced levels of social distancing without any extra data. It's easy to buy both of those arguments, which is why actually the argument in the press hasn't really been about that complex principles-based difference. It's been much more down to brass tacks, will these apps work? Because there is a quirk to all of this, which is that the decentralized model is backed by Apple and Google, the makers of the two main smartphone operating systems. They've built extra tools into their operating systems, which will be launched in mid-May, which will support the decentralized model, which will make any app, any healthcare service around the world who builds a decentralized model work better, work smoother, fail less often, and have effectively more and more accurate exposure notifications. By picking a centralized model, the NHS has decided to go it alone. It's foregone the help of Apple and Google in building this app, and it's opened itself up to potential problems. The worst case scenario being what Singapore had when it built its equivalent app last month, which was an app that simply didn't work if it wasn't unlocked on your phone and open on the screen. In other words, if you were playing Candy Crush, no contact tracing. If your screen was locked, no contact tracing. If you ran out of battery, no contact tracing, but that's true for everyone. But because your screen had to be on all the time, your battery ran down faster. That's not a very good app, even if you manage to get people to install it. If it doesn't do contact tracing, it doesn't help. So there's the principles-based layer, but then way below that is just, does this stuff work? Can we build an app which actually gets these contacts and notifies people of potential exposure?
And the issue there, so there's these sort of grand issues about decentralized versus centralized app, but then there's this, it's almost banal, but probably the most important one, which is about battery life, right? So the Apple and Google system, they're going to allow it to work in the background. So you're not using the app, but it's still pinging out this Bluetooth information all the time. but they're quite reluctant to let any app on a different centralized system have that same privilege. So if the NHS make their own centralized app, Google and Apple won't give them permission to constantly ping out Bluetooth information in the background. So it will only really work if people are constantly on this app having it open, which seems quite unrealistic.
Exactly. To the NHS's credit, based on what we've seen from the app that they're trialing in the Isle of Wight right now, they've done a much, much better job than a lot of other countries have in overcoming this burden. It looks likely that the NHS has built an app which does successfully run in the background for quite some time after it loses focus, and manages through some nice coding, basically, to avoid being shut down to preserve battery life. But there is still this fundamental problem that it doesn't have that get out of jail free card that Apple and Google are giving around. Now, if we want to bring a principles-led thing to that level, there is the real question of who the hell are Apple and Google to tell the NHS what the best way to run a COVID tracing app is. Apple and Google are not epidemiologists. Apple and Google do not really have the authority to overrule a National Health Service on the best way to tackle an outbreak. Apple and Google have made a policy decision, which is the decision that they do not feel comfortable supporting centralized apps. And they're enforcing that through an engineering control, which is that they get to build the APIs and they don't want to build this API. It's not, some people have compared this to the question of whether they sort of break encryption for governments, but it's not that simple, because this isn't about asking them to build something that they haven't built. This is about asking them to hand over a key that they've already got to the NHS. And they're saying no, but it's a questionable decision whether that is the right thing to do.
And so in principle, the government could say, unless you let our centralized app run in the background on your phones, we'll stop you operating in the UK. I mean, obviously, there'd be a really enormous game of chicken there, because the government wouldn't be particularly popular if everyone's iOS or Android device suddenly stopped working.
Right.
But you can sort of imagine, you can imagine a strange standoff going on.
Yeah, and the UK government isn't the only government which is in this position. The UK government is reluctantly accepting its position, as best I understand it. They have talked about potentially switching if it becomes clear that the Apple and Google approach is better, but they accept that if they don't build with the Apple and Google approach, they don't get help from Apple and Google. France's government is being much more fighty. France's digital minister, Cédric O, has taken to the press multiple times to shout at Apple and Google, basically, and to go, it is outrageous that you're not helping us with this. We need this. Who are you to say no? Which is a legitimate question. Who are they to say no? This is a healthcare decision at its heart, and it's a decision of healthcare policy. And it's not entirely clear why Apple and Google should have a veto over it.
I suppose my final question, or what are the sort of ideological dividing lines here? Because on one level, this is a very technical question, but at the same time, I suppose if you ask most of our audience, who do you side with in a fight? You'd say, let's go for the centralized NHS system versus the completely unaccountable Apple and Google system. But at the same time, this idea of a decentralized system with no central control is often quite attractive to our audience as well. I mean, I've seen Guido Fawkes coming out very strongly in favor of this decentralized Apple Android system. Is there an ideological question here, or do you think the government are being overwhelmingly pragmatic here?
The government are being, like, Lord help me, I don't like giving this government credit, but they're being pragmatic. There's a few ideological schisms. There's the sort of privacy activist wedge, which is where you get that unlikely alliance between Guido Fawkes and a lot of the sort of libertarian left, the idea that, generally speaking, government collecting huge batches of data about every citizen might be a bad thing that can be abused. You don't have to look very far to see why that's the case. We're still going through the after effects of the hostile environment policy, which has never formally been repealed or rebuked. But then there's another more interesting schism, which is basically around how much you see this as an NHS policy versus a government policy versus very specifically a Dominic Cummings policy. People who view it as an NHS app and an NHS policy, by and large, bring positive attitudes to the NHS with them on that, and view it in the narrative that the government wants it to be viewed as a, stay at home, install the app, protect the NHS, save lives. And that's a really compelling frame. Less trust comes if you view this as a government app. If you look at this as a very Matt Hancock sort of thing, the man who moved from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport over to the Department for Health and Social Care, who loves building apps so much he built an app called Matt Hancock MP, who set up NHSX originally as a sort of Matt Hancock skunkworks project and then gave it the app to build. If you view it as that, there's a little bit more doubt. And then if you hang out on FUDP Twitter too much, the really hardcore Remain Twitter, there's a view that actually all of this is linked very strongly to Dominic Cummings, that Dominic Cummings is the man who weaseled his way onto Sage, that Dominic Cummings has weird links with the data community through his Brexit fiddling, and that Dominic Cummings is now going to get his hands on the NHS COVID app data, and what he'll do with that doesn't bear thinking about. I'm perhaps being unfair, but I don't think that's a particularly reasonable view. The evidence that I've seen doesn't suggest that Dominic Cummings actually is particularly linked to this, but he's a fearsome bogeyman, and people who hate him really hate him. And I think it does speak at the very least to a failure of government comms that they've not managed to push this app as a politically neutral, NHS-led thing that will be used exclusively and only for fighting this pandemic and saving lives, because that's the message they need to be putting out, because that's what they need to be doing.
So ultimately, there is a possibility that the whole Brexit saga will end with ultra-Remainers becoming COVID-19 super spreaders.
I'll let that be your words.
Alex Hern, thank you so much for joining us this evening. That was incredibly informative.
Cheers.
I think I've still got Aaron on the line.
Don't worry, Michael.
We're going to go very quickly to some of your questions, although we are running out of time as well. So we've had some super chats from Luke Rogers and Richard Deutsch, both asking for our thoughts on Keir Starmer at PMQs today. Did you watch those, Aaron?
Yeah, I did. I thought he was good. I thought it was quite forgettable. But then he's done some nice clips, and the framing of the tweets with the videos that have been posted has been quite antagonistic, quite good. My criticism aren't really of Keir Starmer. I think there's a misreading here to an extent. I just don't think that PMQs has the political importance that a certain subsection of liberal opinion thinks that it does. And I certainly don't think it shapes public opinion in the way they think it does. So he is better than Boris Johnson. Not that much better than I think is being claimed, but clearly better. But I don't think it matters to the extent that it's going to determine who wins the next general election.
I mean, it's a kind of stupid thing to say, but I mean, he looks good. Like, I know there are more important things in politics, but when I looked at the clip today on Twitter after watching it on TV, I was slightly underwhelmed watching it live. I thought that Keir Starmer sort of set up Boris Johnson to give a number of unsatisfactory answers and didn't quite twist the knife. So there was a point, for example, where he asked whether or what Boris Johnson thought about Jenny Harris, as we talked about earlier, saying that the reason the government hadn't tested earlier was because of capacity. I think Keir Starmer wanted Boris Johnson to sort of stand up and admit that. I would have gone back for a follow-up to say, well, if it was for capacity, why did you say it was about this why did you say it was about epidemiology back in March? And it's really important that in the future we can believe what you say. So can you guarantee that when we're discussing exiting this lockdown, you never again mislead us to try and distract from previous failures? Because that's important for public health reasons. This isn't for political point scoring. But he kind of just moved on. But it did translate into a very good Twitter clip. So I mean, it was obviously a lot better than last week.
I mean, what I would say is that Jeremy Corbyn got large numbers of people to vote Labour in the last two elections, more so obviously in 2017, but even in the last election in 2019, 10.3 million was more than in 2005, 2010, 2015. But what we have to understand on the left is, Jeremy Corbyn was always going to get more people to vote for him than, say, Ed Miliband. He also did get more people to vote for the Tories, right? He did, so the argument about, 2017, historic highs, 40% of the vote, that's true. But I think inarguably, he does put 2, 3, 4% on the Tory vote just without opening his mouth. That's because of the media. That's because of misrepresentation of who he is. But those are the facts. Keir Starmer, clearly, the first thing he should be trying to do is to neutralise that. Can he? Well, it will remain to be seen. But I think you're right. He looked good. I mean, that's something which he's engaging with. However, the Tories are polling 50% right now. So whether or not it's a it's going to be a successful strategy. Who knows? But I thought he was very good in PMQs today. But like you said, the clips in particular are very good.
And I think we both agree that he hasn't done quite enough yet to lead public opinion when it comes to the government's response to coronavirus, even if he has sort of ingratiated himself with the public. I think people do seem to have warmed to him as a potential prime minister, even if he hasn't done much to switch them off from Boris Johnson. So if we were to go into a general election at this point, obviously the Conservatives would stomp home, because why get rid of the devil, if no one has even toxified them, which hasn't happened at this point.
Can I also say, I think Keir Starmer, I think I've said this before, he comes across as a really impressive administrator, but leader of the opposition is a very different job. There's a part of being leader of the opposition, you have to be a bit of a populist. And Labour in opposition have always been more radical than they've been in government, going back, to the 40s and the 50s. So I do think that from a strategic communications point of view, I think he's been a failure. Right, I think he's not been able to shape public opinion from the opposition benches in a way that Jeremy Corbyn did before him. Where he's been good is these, it's getting ridiculous now how much people say forensic with the PMQs and so on. But in his defence, look, the first one isn't his job, right? He's just one guy. You need a big team around him to do these things. And I think my major misgiving around Keir Starmer so far is I look at his advisors. They may all be great. They may all be nice people. But you often saw this pitch, or you get Keir Starmer, we'll get the professionals in. And actually, many of these people were just working in Labour Party politics before, and they're quite young and they haven't really got an amazing CV. And that's fine. Maybe that will work. But this idea that Keir Starmer will come in, he'll bring world-class professionals from all different spheres of life. And that's plainly not happening. And I do wonder, given the scale of the challenge, is that a bit of a missed opportunity? Because it's something I would have loved to see Jeremy Corbyn do, for instance. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn recruited wide enough and didn't take advantage of so much goodwill that was drawn towards this project, particularly after 2017. I think Keir Starmer could do something similar.
This will, I'm sure, be a conversation that comes around again with the question of who is employed as Labour Party General Secretary. I think we're going to find out in the next 2 weeks. Very truncated timetable for doing that. But Aaron, I'm going to have to let you go now. It's been a pleasure as always.
My pleasure.
Thank you to our viewers for watching, and thank you for all of your super chats. There have been lots of them this evening. That is a massive help for Novara Media. If you want to become a subscriber, which is the most useful thing you can do, please go to novaramedia.com/support. We appreciate our regular subscribers so much. Thank you. If you are already one, you make this show possible. We'll be back on Friday. We're not doing shows on Thursday for the time being. So see you then. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.